Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I'm glad that you were able to give me that PhD like that. So I'm actually a chapter away from that, but I'm getting there. I'm close. So, but I'm happy to address you. I would start out by saying, you know, the title of this presentation, What's Working and What's Not, was not my idea, because if I knew what was working, I wouldn't be here today. I'd be very wealthy, but you know, we'll try to share some things about things that we're learning along the way. And so what I thought I would do was talk about working with data in prosecutors' offices. In my role at JSS, I've worked in several prosecutors' offices from Miami to LA, San Francisco, Austin, Las Vegas, different places. And so I've gotten a sense of how y'all kind of organize your data. And I thought I'd share a little bit about those experiences. Talk about some of the research studies that we've been pulling together, and then talk about a survey that we're doing under one of the projects that we're hoping that y'all become involved with. So, just to start with, I would say you guys have a lot of data. You have a ton of data. I don't know if you recognize that, but you have mountains and mountains of data. I think you may have more data than the police departments do, because you end up where everything comes together in one place. So all of the police department data ends up at your offices. The problem with your data is that there's a lot of, I think your offices are set up more on a case to case to case, not as an overview look at it. So when I've gone in there, for example, I went in early in one of the projects and said, you know, how many gun violence cases do you prosecute? And they were like, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 a month, right? And I said, well, can we like track that and see? Well, they were moving through 200 a month and didn't even realize that that's what they were doing, because they were so focused on case to case to case, instead of looking at it from a simple count. The other thing is that the data is, I don't know, what is it about your attorneys? You like words? Like I'm a geek, I like numbers. I'm not a big word person, but you guys like words. So like I have to read all of your words to find the data in your words. You have a lot of text data. And accessing that text data and pulling information out of it is a real challenge. So a lot of you, some of you have master name indexes, which allow us to be able to identify, you know, repeat offenders. Some of you don't have master name indexes. This presents a real strong problem when you're trying to do anything with chronic offenders, because there's a lot of Henry Samuels out there, and trying to figure out, is this the same person or not? So a lot of you don't capture any address data. And address data is one of the key research areas we're finding to be able to work on violent crime in particular, and property crime, having address data. So these are areas where it's a real challenge, I think, working there. If you have address data, great, that's fantastic. And then the text data. So I kind of look at it, I go in and say, okay, how do you make this data sing? How do you pull it out of all of the information that you have? What does it take? And so I'm going to show you a series of charts and talk a little bit about just how data can get manipulated or seen. And some of this is pretty basic, but we'll start the basic and then move up. So there's a chart. This is a pretty flat, smooth line across here of showing information. And then we have a chart that has some more wiggles and squiggles in it, but not too wiggly or squiggly. And then we have a chart that has a whole bunch of squiggles in it. Kind of looks like a heart monitor, a badly scared heart monitor. But I would say to you, this data is all the same data, just shown differently by the time period. And so that's the question that I would say to y'all when you're asking question is, what is the question you're asking? And what is the unit of analysis that you're looking for? And that's really a base that has to happen in terms of how you're interpreting the data that's coming out of your office, is really think about what is it that you want to know, and how do you see that. And when you're working with researchers, I would always stand on them about what is the unit of analysis that you're doing this analysis on. Because that's where we start to see some real interesting research, I think, come out. I mean, one of the things, like I'm always on people, is they'll come out and they'll say, you know, we had a 50% increase in violent crime. It went from 2 to 4, right? And you really want to understand, okay, what are those numbers meaning and how are we going forward? So I'm going to go through some case studies. And a couple of these we've been brought in to launch a crime strategies unit. And when you think about a crime strategies unit, there's really about 3 things that are necessary to really make them work. One is that you need some software and hardware technology to go with it. You need someone or some folks who have advanced data analysis skills. and can do statistics and can do different types of things, and you need some resources to support them as they try to call all your data together. And you're really looking at things to do triangulation, multi-method models to be able to analyze the data and to do some power analysis of what you're looking at data-wise. But what we find is that most of you have no funds to do this. So that's what we've kind of gotten into the niche of how do we help prosecutors' offices to move forward in doing this. And the way we've always started when we go in is we start with simple statistics like I just talked about. How many of these do you have? Answer the simple, what is the process for this? How many cases? Where are these cases happening? And basic mapping. Then we move to intermediate analysis where we're asking the prosecutors to think about leaving the office and going out into the community and try to find the crime drivers and try to understand where are these places that are causing problems in the community and the cases to go through. We do what we call systematic social observations, where we teach the prosecutors, particularly community prosecutors, how to walk the neighborhoods and actually code and analyze what's going on in those neighborhoods, looking around for environmental design issues, and also what are people doing in that neighborhood. And this starts to lead into an analysis about chronic offenders and chronic locations. And then we move into advanced analysis and outcomes in terms of social network analysis and trajectory analysis. These are just types of analysis that we're doing. But this is a way we try to step prosecutors' offices through thinking about their data differently so that they can do their analysis going forward. So, in South Florida, like I mentioned, I went in and said, how many gun cases do you have? And then they started asking me, you know, by the highest charge, by the final charge, and you know, how do you drive down into this? And so I worked and worked and worked at this, and I created this map that showed all of the gun violence cases in South Florida based on 3 different offices. And from this map, they got really excited, except that it was an interesting map. It didn't tell them a lot, except that they had a lot of gun cases. So they asked me to come up with how many of them were defendants under the age of 20 years old, under 20 years old, who had firearms charges, so that they could really drill down. So we drilled down into that, and then we were able to drill down into even further, into the ones that were repeat offenders. I don't have that map, but this is the kind of basic analysis that we were able to do to help them understand the level of gun violence. So, the other thing we do with the basic information is we do some validating. This is a social network analysis that we did to validate data that was coming in from the police department. And in the middle, you'll see an individual who was the victim of a homicide. But then it was interesting because we have an arrest report. So the homicide occurred on November 11th, and then we have an arrest report that he was arrested on 12/1, which was a validation point for us in the data to say there's something wrong with this arrest report before they went forward. And so you can pick out this kind of stuff if you start to analyze your data, which helped them a lot with their case because they were trying to do a RICO case. And this would have slipped right by had we not been able to do this analysis for them, and this base analysis to say, we have a problem here. He couldn't have been arrested on this date. So, this was a case where the police department came to the prosecutor's office. I was working there, and they were like, they wanted to start this RICO case because they had this burglary problem, and they were really onto this. We have this burglary problem. You know, it's this gang that's doing all this and everything, and so we kept doing the analysis, and after about a month and a half of analyzing it, we realized they didn't have a burglary problem, they had a burglar. They had this one person who was really very good at doing burglaries, and so he lived right in the area, and he was really responsible for all of these, and so we were able to not go down the road of doing a RICO case but on this gang, but actually just identify him as a chronic offender and to move forward. So. In terms of maps, these are some basic hotspot maps that you see typically coming out of police departments. They kind of give you general areas of what's going on, but they, you can get a lot more specific nowadays, and the specificity, I think, is where you can start to really jump forward. And so what we've started moving people forward on, because you do have the data, is what we call trajectory analysis. And what we're doing with trajectory analysis is we're able to find actually those street segments where crime has been persistent, and it's persistently high or it's persistently increasing over time. And so here what you're seeing is the orange lines, the little orange street segments, are where crime over 8 years has been persistent. And these are areas where we would say to community prosecutors, go out and look at these street segments and see what you think about them. The red lines are where crime has been persistent and it's been increasing over time. So if you want to focus your research or your resources, these are street segments that we would say, while you're overwhelmed, you can tag these street segments in your data coming in and say, okay, if we get arrest reports on these street segments, we need to look at them more closely. So this is that really focusing down, and this is, your data is rich enough to be able to get down to this very, very specific area to target things. So. And then when you really get crazy, you can do really difficult social network analysis to start to bake up some of these criminal organizations that are working. We did this off of credit cards that came out of a car that would stop, and they gave us an entire 2 shoe boxes of credit cards, and then we worked our way and started linking everybody together off of these credit cards, and then going back to who was where. So in terms of what I would say, what we're seeing is working with police departments, and what we're working on is moving towards targeting micro-geographic areas, not just hotspots, but micro-geographic areas, and being very focused that we're finding that these very, very small areas are the crime drivers, and that if you can deal with those areas, you can actually start to see violent crime start to come down. The other area that we've seen to really work on violent crime is the focus on the chronic offenders. And this is one where you really have to work so that you're doing it appropriately, but you are analyzing who are repeat offenders, why are they coming back through, who are they associated with, and how are they operating. So those are 2 things that have come out, I think, of the Smart Prosecution project that we've been working on. Is the more focused you can be, the higher that return has been coming. So moving to the second issue, we do have a contract from the Bureau of Justice Assistance called the National Prosecutors Consortium. It is done jointly with Justice Security Strategies, the Prosecutors Center for Excellence, and BJA. It's a cooperative agreement. I'm involved, Dr. Craig Uchida is involved, Mario Chattina here is involved, Chris Hammond, Jennifer Joyce, we're all working together on this. And so what we're trying to do with this cooperative agreement is focus on your role and what you're doing to reduce crime, to improve community trust, and to encourage witness cooperation. And we're looking at what are you out there doing now. We're looking at your websites, we're looking at articles about your agencies, we're talking to you to pull this together, to give back to you, to say this is what your peers are doing, this is how you're working together. We're also going through all of the research journals that are out there, so we can help answer your question. We're up to like 220, I think, research articles that we've read now, and we're coding them by the type of journal they're in, and by the rigorousness of the research and the methodology, to be able to say, okay, in this area, this is what research has been done in the last 15 years and produced. So we're getting that out, and I hope to have that out on a website for y'all to be able to start accessing in the next month and a half. So that'll be like an online library. The other thing that we're doing is we're putting together a survey, which is a survey of as many of you as we can do, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and then we're providing TA. So, and the focus of this project is to assist you. It is a TA project that is meant to give information. We got feedback from you about what you're interested in. Y'all told Chris a lot about what you're interested in, and we, the geeks, have been trying to figure out how to make that happen in the back end. And to demonstrate your role and how that's expanded, and that takes collecting information from you. So, the research article review, like I said, we're going in, we're pulling out these little vignettes to say, for example, on the lever pulling, you know, they found that there was I think a 12% decrease using focused deterrence lever pulling strategies in this one community. So you'll be able to see those things to see what are the highlights of these different types of research that are out there. So I'll just go through that. And then, like I said, we're going through your databases and your website. So if you have stuff on your website, we're pulling that together to say, okay, what do you do? What diversion programs are you doing? What special courts do you have? How are you organizing your folks? The survey that we're doing is, we saw that it's been a long time since y'all had a survey, and y'all completed a survey. I think the BJS survey has been about 10 years, and so we're trying to update that, but to give you more information, and to get a sense of the context that you're working in. We've done a pilot, we're launching a pilot out of Michigan. They're currently completing the survey. It's not really that long. It has sections that we're going to be asking across the country, and then it has a section that is specific to the state, a module of questions, so that if you need information to use with your legislature or with other people, then you'll have that information. So we do have a flexibility in how we design the survey. It's asking about staffing, budgets, caseloads, the types of programs you're doing, the technology, research that you might be doing, how you're doing community outreach. So it has a lot of potential, I think, to give a lot of feedback to you. It is an online survey, and it's a survey where you can answer some questions, send the survey around, have other people answer those questions before you complete the whole thing. So you can go back and forth to it. So far it seems to be going well, right, Chris? People seem to be liking it. And I think the fact that we can have a module that's specific to your state, where you can answer your specific questions, is one of the benefits that we're trying to get back to you. Training and technical assistance we're available to provide on these topics of violence, crime strategies units, community programs, discovery, research capabilities. And the way we're delivering this TA is sort of threefold. We have TA where it's TA Light, I call it, where if you just want one of these studies that we identify, we can ship that thing out to you, find it for you. We'll be an arm for you to research that. TA Medium would be if we know of another of your peers that's doing one of these crime strategies units or is doing some sort of court that you want to know about, we can help facilitate getting y'all together, both on the phone or in person. We can support that. And then TA Max, which is a site visit where you have a really big problem and we need to spend some time and work through that problem. We can put together a team that can do that and go forward. So if you're interested in that, just email us at National Prosecutors Consortium, npc@jssinc.org, and we'll fly out there in our super hero suits and try to help you out in our researchy geeky way. So if you have any questions, I'll answer them, but otherwise I will turn it over back to you and say thank you.
Well, thank you to Christine and to Denise for bringing me to Salt Lake City today. It's wonderful to be here. I do want to say sorry to Beth, because Beth from Denver has heard me speak so many times this year that I really think she should just come up here and give this presentation. It's really, really fun to be here. I direct a group at New York University called Beta Hub, and Beta Hub, the idea behind Beta Hub is really to kind of test new thinking. We kind of audition new ideas. And our real goal primarily is based off of a frustration I think many of us came off of, who are members of the team, was that we didn't think enough of the research was really informed by the voices of the people who worked within the systems. So even within our work with prosecutor offices, we get there and we have to, we engage with district attorneys, but as quickly as possible we spend a lot of time with the ADAs, who we find are chatty Cathys. They have plenty to say, and generally they have great ideas, and it's been really wonderful to spend time with them and to have the opportunity to learn from you and with you. The initiative I'll talk mostly about today, and even that is morphing, I think with some humility, we're learning as we're going, is the one which is called BetaGov, and the idea there, as Denise mentioned in her introduction, is this idea of rapid cycle research, that we need to be able to increase the pace of learning in the government sector. Because what we found is that most of what you do is really has never been tested. There's so many decisions that you make in day-to-day jobs that could go in different directions, and they're kind of mostly taken on an act of faith. And not everybody is Sci-Bonds, right? Not everybody has those amazing resources in the offices, right, to do that sort of learning. So many of the prosecutor offices we engage with really don't have a lot of that analytical muscle or data exploration muscle that's needed to just figure stuff out. Sometimes when we're called in, really all it takes is 20 minutes of a data scientist's time to help them really solve a big question that's been hanging over their heads and allow them to see this aspect of their work in a completely different light. So yay, data, just to underscore Shelley's, she teed me up beautifully here. And And I think one of the reasons we've made it so difficult for the government sector to engage us as researchers is just how we go about doing research. Denise mentioned this idea of often there's almost a fear of researchers, like you let them in, and especially if you're in policing or prosecution, there's this temptation to do gotcha research, right? It's like, this is this data, let's expose them rather than help them. So I think it's really important to find research collaborators who are really wanting to meet you where you're at and help you troubleshoot and solve problems together. And that, you really have to find that person, because there is that tendency. It's easy to publish if you're exposing something awful. It's harder to do the hard work of really working alongside people and say, let's figure this out, let's find the problems, and let's solve these problems collaboratively. So, another challenge with the research, and Denise mentioned this, is that I think traditionally, and this is changing a little bit, I think there's glimmers of hope, the research has been really slow. So we looked at the NIJ studies, and on average, if you were doing a study in criminal justice, it was taking about 5 years from the time it was submitted until the time the report came out. And for most of the practitioners we engage with, that timeline just makes the research completely irrelevant. I mean, in some of the fields we work in, on corrections, for example, the average director of a Department of Corrections turns over every 2 years. If the research is taking 5 years, that person's changed places 2 times over already by the time the research results are out. So we need a different way of doing this. We've heard talk today about evidence-based programs and practices, and we're university-based, so we love those, of course, but there are some challenges of that idea too. And, especially I think, as for many of you know, you're still managing serious problems, right? You really have, even when we look at programs that seem to be doing really well, there's still a lot of room for improvement. So we don't want to get ourselves too locked in, right? We still want to make sure we're looking at our data and trying to figure out how to keep moving that dial in the right direction. And another thing I've really felt as a researcher, in a way, almost being burned by this, was this issue of transferability. You can have something that's really a useful idea generated in one jurisdiction, and even with the really good quality research shows good outcomes, but if you take that and you plant it in a different jurisdiction with a different set of budget realities, a different culture facing different drug issues or whatever else is going on, you might end up with a very different sort of result. So the onus has to be on you, no matter what you're plucking off a shelf, especially if it has a manual and a name, an acronym. If it's acronym, it must be good, right? If you're taking something off the shelf, still test it. Still test it in your backyard. Make sure it's working for you. So I think really this idea of evidence-generating practices rather than evidence-based practices, because you have to keep the idea of the evidence alive, right? Is it still working, no matter what the label is that's been applied? And then for heaven's sake, let's please be in the business of still having space for something new, right? We have to realize that the world is changing around us so quickly. If we get too complacent too quickly and lock ourselves into things, we're just going to miss the opportunity to keep creating and keep innovating and helping the people that we're serving. So in the work that we do, we really do lean in and try as much as we can to do a lot of listening, both to the clients that you're serving as well as your staff. So we listen to your team and we ask them about the ideas that they have for how can you improve operational practices, or what ideas do they have about how to improve outcomes. We do also speak to the clients that you're serving. And this has been especially true for, I think, our in-custody work. Some of the best initiatives we've developed has been completely informed by the people who are living within the systems. And so that idea of even client innovation is being put to the test. And then finally, data-driven innovation. So often, and I used to be what's called a randomista. It's actually a negative term. It's people who are seriously committed to the idea of a randomized controlled trial. And what we've increasingly learned is, yes, there's a place for that, but it's not everything. But really what we need more than anything is a better understanding of our own data. And I have worked as a district attorney. Several of you in this room will know who I'm talking about, who literally showed me how he did outcomes analyses. And it was a piece of paper, and it was tally marks. He'd just go through cases and and it was in pencil, just tally marks. And that was like his outcomes reporting. And I think you know who he is. He's in Wisconsin. And it's just not a good way to figure out how the world works. So what we do need, especially in prosecution, because the stakes are so high in your offices, is more speed. We need to get to more information more quickly, and this is a new project we're breeding right now, and much more granularity. And think about this in terms of being a hospital administrator. If someone presents to you at a hospital and they're sick and they have a high fever, we take their temperature all the time, right? We take their temperature regularly and make sure that their temperatures come down over this period of time. But if you're running a criminal justice agency, we take the average temperature over the hospital over a period of 1 year. things, and then we're done. What's happened to your diversion cases? What's happened to the people who you send to Better's intervention program? What's happened to them next month and the following month, right? Don't wait for the 3-year report to come out to tell you something about BIP. Know now. This is 2018. We should have the systems in place. There should be some urgency around this. We have to start behaving like hospital administrators rather than, I don't know, I was going to say something negative, but that's not cool. And then don't even get me started. And Dan's here. Dan, I didn't know you'd be here, otherwise I would have put your work into this. I had a conversation with Dan's team the other day because they're interested in having us work with them on an evaluation of a juvenile program. And I got into the call with them and I was kind of fired up. I'd been speaking about recidivism and I was a little agitated. And Dan's team's on the phone and they say, we want to do this study on this juvenile intervention. And I said, okay, that's fine, as long as you don't tell me to track recidivism. Because if another person speaks to me about recidivism, I'm going to commit a felony. Because let me tell you about recidivism, what a crude measure that is. Because of how it's usually calculated by most researchers, it's a number and it's a 0 or a 1. You're a recidivist or you're not. I've seen so many good programs die by the measure of recidivism because recidivism in the year before looked the same as the recidivism in the year afterwards. But if you look granular, if you looked at those cases, those kids were hurting people then, now they're doing silly stuff now. That's, yes, recidivism looks the same, we've changed that human. And in the meantime, by that silly, stupid measure, we've killed good programs. So we really have to be more nuanced in how we think about information, right? If we're really going to track progress. Some of our studies complete in hours, and I'm not making that up. Some of them complete in weeks. Our average time of turnaround is about 3.5 months. It really depends on what you're doing. I wanted to give a couple of examples and then switch into talking about some of the work we're doing in prosecution. And I know I'm going to run long, so I apologize. I'm going to try to speed it up. I speak fast anyway, and I have an accent. On the corrections work, I mentioned, I was so grateful to hear in the earlier panel the talk about please get prosecutors involved in corrections reform. There's so much that you can do. You have really important and credible voices. On the corrections reform side, we were really interested. President Obama had really underscored the need for some reform in solitary confinement. So we started doing some work there, really looking at how we could modify segregation. So many people come home directly from solitary confinement to our communities. I mean, by some estimates, about 10,000 a year, from solitary confinement to onto the bus. And often it's because they're too scared to step them down through levels of security in prison. They're too scared to put them in level 3, but they're on the bus. So we thought that we really needed to do this differently, right? How do we do this? And the idea was really working collaboratively with the people who lived in the system and worked in the system, mental health, corrections officers, coming up with ideas that would transform practice. And by one at a time, we started finding that these really simple things were starting to make a difference. We started thinking about space, that space, what's happening in terms of space, not just in corrections, but even on the streets. So looking at environmental markers, we heard from Mike earlier today about that environmental design. Sometimes the tweaks are so small, but make a difference. What are those sorts of nudges that we can do to make a difference? We started being really interested in testing new technologies, initially for people coming home out of prison, for re-entrants who are coming out after long periods in custody, who did not know how to cross a street, who had no idea how to go shopping in a supermarket, what an ATM looks like, what a cell phone looks like. We can introduce them virtually to all of these basic concepts that all of us live and breathe that they find so terrifying. So this is a group we started with in Pennsylvania. These are juvenile lifers who went in as teenage boys and they're coming out, older than I am, and I'm not young. It was just horrifying for them, this thought of being released, right? And so they could virtually learn how to do their laundry. They could virtually, thanks to machine learning, they could start doing job interviews. With the machine, understanding and being able to interpret accents and responses, they could go grocery shopping, they could go banking. Then we started looking at applications in law enforcement. We're now looking, we've actually just received an award from the Department of Justice to do this work with law enforcement on how do we get law enforcement to interact better on the streets with people who are experiencing substance abuse and mental health crisis. We're also using virtual now. We also received an award on this one for looking at how to use virtual for people who are involved with opioid use. So we'll see how this is very exploratory, but we'll see how that works out. Lots of phone tests, there are all sorts of how can we get people to just move through the system better, whether it's appointment reminders for court appointments, whether it's medication adherence for the seriously mentally ill. And in Seattle we have an RCT underway, which I really love, with Seattle Police Department on using cell phones, distributing cell phones to families who are unhoused living out of their cars, which is a real problem in Seattle right now. How do we move them into formal housing more quickly, because they tend to get lost because they just can't track down the families. Something we're really encouraging our sites to do is this idea of failing cheerfully. Nothing good can happen unless you're willing to fail cheerfully. We tend to find in the government sector that if there's a failure, they just circle the wagons and pretend it's not there, rather than really just learning from it and moving on and saying it and embracing it and saying that didn't work the way we expected it to do. Let's just move on. So I want to give you a couple of examples from the work we're doing in prosecution. And again, I didn't know who was going to be here. I would have changed the setup a little bit differently for some of you in the room. In our rapid cycle field experiments, that's really listening, that's leading in listening to prosecutors or ADAs or people that they're working with and figuring out strategies to quickly try something new. So one that I'm really appreciating right now, and actually probation is the wrong term, it launched September 1, was pre-trial diversion. And the prosecutor said to us the concern he had is that if he looked at his diversionary program, the first 6 months of it is useful. There's something therapeutic. There's something helpful there. But the back end of that, which is a year, another year, or another 6 months, just trips people up. It's like, do we need it to be more than 6 or 7 months once they finish that, or can we cut them loose? So we actually have a randomized controlled trial underway right now, looking at that pretrial diversion dose. We make up those numbers, right? There's no literature that says to us the magic dose is 12 months or 18 months or 24 months. We make it up, right? So we can stop making these numbers up and bring some evidence to bear. We might be able to make a difference. We also have a series of prosecutors now we're working with on prosecutor-led opioid responses to opioid use. I wanted to quickly move into the area of data-rific, though, and examples in prosecution, because I can tell you, and this, if you don't know this already, you might sense this. I think when you think about research in the future as being someone within the criminal justice system, that's primarily those researchers have been social scientists. I think looking forward into the future, what you're going to see, you'll still have those social scientists, but more than anything, you're going to see the entry of the hard scientists. And I think we really should embrace that. People who really understand data well and how to use your data well. So I want to talk with you a little bit about some of the data projects we worked on and how little it took to really learn a lot and really to lead to action very quickly. And the first was a case where a prosecutor came to us and he flew to New York with his data analyst who, the term data analyst I'd never seen a data analyst who wasn't able to analyze data, but she was very nice. And we love her, we work with her, but she wasn't really an analyst. And we brought her to our office and the district attorney, and we asked them, he said he's really concerned about his prostitution case filings. Could we take a look at his data? And they had their computers with them, so we said, sure. So we plucked literally a junior data scientist out of our office and put her next to this district attorney. And 20 minutes later, he was looking at his prostitution cases, and he was aghast. And he said, I've never seen this data, and they're so young, and look at what we're doing to them. And that day, he went home, and meanwhile, we paired him up with a forensic psychiatrist who works with under 25-year-olds. And he went back and just started really handling those cases very differently than what he was doing. And then he was just more mindful because he had his data, and an accident of that meeting was he actually had some details on those cases. And one thing in particular he had was race ethnicity, which he'd never seen before applied to his cases. And he noticed that most of the women, and they were mostly women, most of the women he was filing charges on were black. He comes from a county where 3% of the population is black. And he was like, this doesn't make sense. Where are these cases coming from? So it got them exploring this issue of what's going on in their cases, and what they realized is that there was a real problem in the community, that the police were running, both the sheriff's office and the police were running sting operations and bringing women in from other counties into their community, and then they were making the arrests. And then he was offering now this useful diversionary program into something helpful, but he couldn't offer it to them because they were from a different county. So he really was able to take that data and demonstrate to the county the unnecessary harms that they were causing, and they stopped their practices. And again, I think collectively there was probably an hour of data science. Another case I'd like to know, I think there might be someone from Santa Clara here. We worked with Santa Clara on a case delay issue. Santa Clara had a really unfriendly report put out by the state saying that they were very slow in their processing of felony cases. And this was the media report that came out. It said 47% of the cases are resolved within a year, compared to 88% for the rest of the states, so they're doing horribly. So we brought in a team, and I'll describe the team in a little bit, but what we really wanted to do was to get a clearer understanding of case delays. So what's going on with the case delays in this jurisdiction? What are the causes of those case delays? Is there something we can help them learn from? And what we found really quickly is that no matter how pretty we're going to make a dashboard for them, which is like, now everybody's into dashboards. Bad news is that Google's actually going to make them for free, so everybody who's really investing in making dashboards is going to be out of a job very soon. But the dashboards, no matter how beautiful the dashboards are, even if Google makes them, if you put junk into that dashboard, you're getting junk out of your dashboard. And what we realized really quickly is that this wasn't a dashboard issue. What this was a data engineering issue. This county didn't know enough about their data because their data was kept in a way that they weren't able to do anything useful. So that meant we had to do this, enter the Geek Squad. And notice how young they are. The one on the left is actually at 88, that's a district attorney. But everybody on the right-hand side, especially the right-hand three, I could have given birth to all four of them, and they know more than they should at their young age, and the two to the left of them are astrophysicists. They are faculty astrophysicists. And to give you a sense what I mean by that, the guy just to the right of Melissa on the left, he's the chief scientist of the New York Observatory. He's a serious astrophysicist, and we took him straight to criminal justice, and he was like, what are you doing with the astrophysicist in the room? It's like, if you have messy data, you need an astrophysicist, because they know more about extracting signal from data than anybody does. And so on the project went, and we brought machine learning into the project, and suddenly we realized we had to learn how to categorize cases, and there were 400 data points, data events, for every person that was coming on average through the system, and we needed to know how to categorize those people and put them into some reasonable typology to understand what was going on. And what we learned through this project is that actually in that jurisdiction, most cases were being resolved in a year. That number 47 was not right. Actually, they were resolving most of the cases, and also a lot of the myths in the office were not true. And on a case and looking at the actual case characteristics of where the delays were, the ADA's sense of what was slowing things down were not correct. And we did find two primary characteristics of delays and a lot of other negative outcomes, and that is age. Young people had a harder time, and then where you lived really mattered. And that was interesting. Where you lived mattered so much more than your race ethnicity. Like it really was a space, it really seems to be like an SES thing, like where you're living was a huge driver. But the myth busting was really fun because they were convinced it was multiple defendant cases. And it turned out that those were actually just a small piece of the problem. There were other things going on. So we're building tools. But we're really much more interested now in focusing on the data engineering side of this. So we really have brought in fact, a new person that we just recruited this week to our team is somebody who's a deep machine learning specialist who's otherwise coding autonomous vehicles. So that's another kind of scientist you really want to bring into criminal justice. And then you actually, I'll tell you saying this, you have more data than you think you do, even if it's in a really smelly, mildewy box. That is data, even if it's on paper. We can get that paper into data form really quickly and help you get those cases into, so you can actually look at your own histories. Something else, I know I'm pretty running out of time, but it's something else I want to mention really quickly, a project that is near and dear to my heart. And one of the reasons I love this project is also because it's a totally pro bono project. Everybody on this project has just donated their time. So coming soon to a neighborhood near you, including yours, is this. This is Abraham Lincoln. In this and like communities, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. Public sentiment really matters. So we're very interested in public sentiment and are rolling out Project Census. Census is Latin for sentiment. The goal there is to see how well can we produce measures of sentiment and therefore help improve, make sure people actually care about their relationship with the communities, because there's a metric now. We can actually say how the relationship with the community is going. So we have a science team put together around that, and the problem statement there was how well could we, in real time, assess public sentiment towards whatever the criminal justice entity is. We started our focus on prosecutors and police. Bring in a new set of data science geeks. One astrophysicist and four others, they're engineers, data scientists, and physicists. And we started off with Twitter, and the idea there is, could we use Twitter to measure sentiment, and then could we have a baseline sentiment so we can tell you when sentiment's moving, right? But actually, something's happening now. Could we get to a point where we could get to a signal around that So Twitter, using Twitter and sentiment analysis is nothing new for the private sector. The public sector's been pretty slow to adopt, but it's really pretty simple. All you do is you take some social media, well, it's not that simple. You take a social media platform, you mine public opinion from it, and then you assign sentiment. You look at, we use natural language processing to figure out the sentiment of what was written about or tweeted about that group. The way I stand here to say this, or we bring in the astrophysicists and the computer scientists and then magic happens, makes it sound really easy. This is the hardest project I think we've ever had. Because people tweet in very sloppy ways, and we were scraping from Twitter. And when they tweet, they use sarcasm, and we had to teach a computer to understand sarcasm, like the good old NYPD breaking the laws as usual. Well, they weren't saying good NYPD, good old NYPD. They're actually negative about the NYPD, but to make sure a machine knows that that's negative and not positive. There was ambiguous semantics, like she kicked a cop in the groin and spat at them, drunk and dumb. Well, that wasn't referring to the cops, it was referring to the she. We have to make a machine understand who the reference point is. You can see how complicated this is. And then you have typos and you're sloppy and you abbreviate. But we have machines that can learn and learn and learn and get better and better and better at doing that. So we started this project with kind of a baseline sentiment for the entire country, and then we brought in some specific jurisdictions. We went with major cities, so we have New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, a couple of others. Any site that was working with us, that's a BetaGov site where we really wanted to bring in the mix, we brought them in. And then we worked with our sites, with a lot of the sites that we were working with, and actually asked them about the kind of the general keywords and specific agencies or specific references to their agencies that they wanted us to include. So this was really collaboratively designed with the people who we were generating sentiment among. I'm going to run out of time, but to give you some sense of the complexity here, Twitter is kind of odd. So we trained initially the machines on the Wall Street Journal comments sections. Every time they posted a criminal justice article, we look at the comments from the Wall Street Journal, and it's easier to train a machine that way because you write a little bit more sloppily when you're commenting on an article you feel unhappy about. And then we started removing the vague words. We had to take out things like tennis court for courts and fashion police for the police, lots of things. We started cleaning and cleaning and cleaning, but every time we cleaned, the computers got smarter. So the first time, just to give you a sense of this, we'd gone through our first round of iterative improvement and then scraped some tweets and manually coded them versus what we would have gotten from the machine and tried to see how much contamination we got, how much stuff should we not have caught. And about 65% of what we were getting was right, and we had 35% more to train. But most of the contamination was predictable. It was tweets about politics and mostly jobs at law firms. So once we could get rid of the job advertising, we could actually be much more specific. So we're getting smarter and smarter and smarter about doing this. We actually have the jurisdiction level work. Twitter shut us down. We're about 3 months into the project and Twitter shut us down. They thought we were up to no good. We've since found a way to get to Twitter, but through Facebook, which is odd. And now we're going to be able to open up again, and that will allow us to get to much more specific precision. Our first work was done on only 200,000 tweets. Now we'll have millions and millions, and then the accuracy for jurisdictions will be better. In this one, you can tell the two red states there are very unhappy, and the blue states are surprisingly happy, but that's not nearly granular enough. We're able to, these are actually specific jurisdictions, and we're starting to extract baseline trends in those jurisdictions, so when we see something like that, that's a statistically significant bump, then we're happy. But that prosecutor's office for a few days, we don't know why. So eventually we'll be able to tie these to events that actually happen, and we can see how people are responding to you. Why do we care? We care about this project because it's very difficult to consistently measure sentiment. It's also very scalable. Once we get this right, we can take it to any jurisdiction in the country and have a consistently collected measure for everybody. And then you can even weigh in and say, I want this or that. You can modify it. It can become quite flexible. So that is low cost and provides, we think, may well, we don't know, but we're hopeful that it will provide useful information. So that is our baby of love. Thank you. I think I'm out of time horribly. Appreciate all of your attention and the ability to catch up on my very rapid speed.